Hey y'all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and in this one I'm going to be covering my round 8 game from the Open Portugal 2019 event. If you've watched any of the recent videos, you know that was having a really great tournament, and I actually guess I'm still having a decent tournament, but I just suffered the worst loss of my career, or most emotional loss of my career, against Grandmaster Vitaly Bernadsky in round 7, where I had a winning position and just made the huge blunder right at the end. So instead of being on 6 out of 7, I was on 5 out of 7 going into this round and playing down. Now, typically, I don't even think about the norm until the last few rounds because you don't want to start doing any calculations in round 4, round 5. It's just way too premature. But now that I've played 7 rounds or 2 rounds to go, I actually did call a friend in the United States. Shout out to Grant Owen, who does a lot of tournament directing work and is really great with the FIDE ratings calculations. And I was asking him, hey, with 5 out of 7 right now, do I still have a chance? What is the scenarios in the last 2 rounds? And he was telling me, look, you're probably going to play down in round 8. You're going to need to win that game, and then you're going to need to win in round 9. So you're going to need to win out. So I knew going into this round that there was still a chance, but that I would need to win in round 8 and round 9. A lot of pressure, and I couldn't even begin to think about round 9 because round 8 was the game in front of me. So just trying to focus on having a good rebound from the last game. So anyways, my opponent here was Nicolo Napoli. I believe he was an FM, around 2300 or so. And I was looking to rebound. So my opponent played d4. I went e6. Again, that had been the theme of this tournament, me inviting French defenses, and my opponent's not going for them. c4 is played, knight f6, knight f3, and d5. D5 is, again, very flexible move. A lot of times, I think I've talked about this before, you can consider going c6, getting a semi-slop type setup. You could develop the bishop to b4. You could develop to e7. You could play knight bd7. Many different ways for black to play against white setup if white goes knight c3. Instead, my opponent went g3, and this is the Catalan system. Very popular opening. Really took hold in the early 2010s because a grandmaster from Israel named Boris Avruk wrote these incredible 1d4 repertoire books, and they're kind of the holy grail of openings books these days in the quality chess companies. So everyone was decided to become a positional Avruk type of player, and I think even the verb Avrukt is what happens to you if you're essentially got caught in an opening novelty that maybe you didn't know about. Anyways, with g3, I went bishop b7, bishop g2, castles, and there are 2 ways to play this position, in my opinion. One way is to release the tension, play d takes c4. The other way is to kind of keep the wall of pawns together, and I went c6, keeping that wall together, in part because the lines are less forcing here than after d takes c4. If d takes c4 is played, white can go for knight e5, and this is a very forcing line where white is able to play for a tiny advantage in an ending, and I wasn't looking to get 15 moves of theory, particularly in a must-win game. So I went c6 to kind of just shore up that wall of pawns. So white went queen c2, that is normal. I went knight bd7, and then knight bd2. There's always this debate in these systems where the knight should go to d2 or to the more natural square c3, and they're kind of pluses and minuses to both. If you put the knight on c3, you're technically hanging the c2 pawn, but white could get a lot of play for it, either playing e4 or even rook d1 might be a little bit better than that, and just play again. Once black is actually taken on c4, this diagonal is wide open for the light squared bishop, and it's just very sharp. Knight bd2 says, you know what, I don't even want to go for these gambits. I'm going to protect the c4 pawn, and I'm still trying to play e4, which is pretty much what the white player wants to do in a dream scenario in these Catalan structures. They want to break the wall of pawns that black essentially has in the center. So the one flaw about knight bd2, though, is that it does block the bishop on c1. And again, it's not on the most active square, which would be c3. So it's not actually influencing the d5 pawn. It's just helping to push e4. So some things to think about. So I went for b6, just trying to develop my bishop. And then rook d1 was played. And now I went for bishop b7, just developing normally. And then white went for e4. And e4 is the move. I mean, you want to try and break open this position. And black has a few options here. I could take on c4, although giving that knight to the c4 square doesn't seem like a great idea. I could consider playing d takes e4, although these types of lines, helping the queen get to the center, typically white would have a slight edge in this type of position. And I also could play a little bit more dynamically and allow white to play e5. Those positions are very sharp, so just to give you a sense, if I played like rook c8, perhaps, allowing e5, and then knight e8, this knight can sometimes pop out to c7, maybe pop out to a6, and I'm trying to break with c5. And again, the argument here is that the knight on d2 is a little bit misplaced. So those are some options that black can essentially go for. I actually decided to play something I knew wasn't really correct, but that would actually keep a lot of pieces on the board and make it a little complicated. And I actually went for c5. Now, c5 is very, very controversial because it's kind of unclear whether I'm ready for the center to be opened. On the one hand, white has this e5 move. On the flip side, white could play what white actually did, which is c takes d5, e takes d5, and e5. And this transformation is typically seen to be pretty much advantageous for white, because what you have is you have a scenario where this e6 pawn is a little bit loose, or it's gone basically, and this structure with the d5 and c5 pawns, they are hanging pawns that are difficult to mobilize, where white has essentially a kingside pawn majority, right? And which actually give white really good attacking chances against my king. So it's very controversial to play this way, but I was really trying to play for the win, so I was willing to take this risk. The reason I felt that it wasn't as bad as it would typically be is because the knight is actually on d2. If the knight was on c3, I wouldn't dare play this way, because d5 pawn would be too weak. The rook would be lined up against d5. Just my position would collapse. But because the knight is on d2, I figured I can get away with this setup by potentially being able to get some counterplay on the queen side very quickly. Again, note that the c file also is going to be open soon. So I went knight e8. White went knight f1 to try and fix that knight. And now I went c takes d4. The reason I went c takes d4 is to just take away this e3 square from the knight, because knight e3, knight f5 would be extremely unpleasant. And not to mention the fact that, again, the knight would be eyeing the d5 pawn. So I was trying to release the tension in the center quick enough to get rook c8, maybe get a piece to c5, who knows, and get some play like that. Rook takes d4 was played. I thought that was an interesting move, trying to shift the rook over, and very, very dangerous looking. But I was also kind of excited to see it because I thought it was extremely aggressive. One thing that I was kind of on the lookout for is actually knight takes d4 and this knight coming to f5. Even at the cost of a pawn, I thought something like knight takes e5, knight f5 would be extremely dangerous. It almost reminds me of these Queen's Indian positions, where white actually sacks a pawn in these d5 lines, and black has this extra pawn on d5, but my king is very airy and I lack development, and my pieces are a little bit misplaced. Although in those lines, again, this knight on f1 that started from b1 would be on c3. So you could see how, these differences matter. So after rook takes d4, I went rook c8, harassing that queen, trying to essentially get it off of the line of the h7, that h7 line, because there were so many lines where I had to think about knight g5 potentially coming, or something like h4 and knight g5, threatening checkmate, and I really have a tough way to deal with. I don't have a great way to deal with that. So after rook c8, queen d1 was played. Again, very happy to see queen d1, and frankly did not expect it. I thought the more natural move was to go queen e2, actually. Going to the back rank seemed weird to me because it makes it harder for the rook to get in the game. So queen d1, knight c7 now. And now you could see kind of my plan is that, if I am able to get my knight to c7, have my rook on this active file, maybe get another piece to c5, I get the counterplay that my isolated pawn kind of affords me. So knight e3, and now knight e6 attacking that d4 rook. So I'm just in time where my d5 pawn is actually not hanging. Rook a4 is played. I thought this was a kind of strange move. I did not expect it. I actually expected the rook to go to g4. I was looking at lines like this, and again, where knight f5 looks really scary. I figured I would have some play here, whether it was connected to d4 or maybe rook e8 and bishop f8. Those were things I was thinking about. Although, you note that if rook e8, knight f5, bishop f8 here is just not good because knight h6 check picks up my queen. So I do have to be kind of alert. But you can see with the rook on g4, knight f5 becomes an idea. Another thing I was looking at was actually h5. And I was thinking, I kick the rook off this square. It does not have h4. It does not have f4 or e4. Like, all these squares are covered, essentially, if you look along the fifth rank, except the a4 square. So maybe, but again, I thought, forcing h5 and then going rook a4 made more sense to me. So anyway, so rook a4 happened, and in some line, my a7 pawn is being hit, and I was actually wondering, do I need to defend it or not? There are some lines where I was thinking I would just ignore it and consider going like knight c5, for instance, and allow rook takes a7, and maybe even think about d4. But what had me actually not go for lines like this was I thought, okay, maybe not d4 here, but let's say I make a move like h6, like a dummy move. The thing that really had me, gave me cause for pause was actually the exchange sacrifice, rook takes b7, believe it or not. And the point is that after a move like knight takes d7, knight takes d5, white secures a very important central pawn. This bishop is screaming along this diagonal, and I think white has more than enough compensation here, particularly with having the two bishops. So I just kind of thought, like, these types of positions are not worth it. They're a little bit too dynamic for white, and not buying that I have an ounce of an advantage here. So, and just to make a point about even queen trades here, like this, queen takes, even these types of positions, I think white has full compensation because my pawn on b6 is weak, this bishop is targeted. I mean, these types of exchange sacrifices are usually pretty promising for white. So because of that, instead of playing knight c5, after rook a4, I went a5, locking out this rook and arguing that, hey, this rook is going to be misplaced and I'm going to hit it with tempo. Knight f5 was played, hitting my my e7 bishop, and I figured, what, I can't really tolerate this knight on f5. And at the same time, if I went for a move like bishop c5, the knight's coming to d6 and forking my bishop and rook anyway. So I thought, what, it's actually time to just play g6. And so I played g6, and it's not a move I wanted to make, but I thought, what, I do have some of my positional integrity on the queen side. I would argue that I'm actually winning on the queen side. I have this space on the c line. My pawns are pretty decently restricting the rook. I'm more developed. These white pieces on c1 and a1 are at home. So I figured, okay, like, this is justifiable. And after g6, white decided to play knight h6 and agreed with me that if you play knight takes e7 here, queen takes e7, my rooks are connected. I already have knight c5 ready. I mean, you can hit my rook with bishop h6, but after rook e8, maybe you don't have a great follow-up. And in a dream scenario, I might actually consider playing d4 and trying to swap these bishops, because then the light squares around white's king would be weak. And note that this e6 knight is really well placed because it covers the g7 square, so it really makes it difficult for a queen to get into anything dangerous because my knight's covering these squares. So Instead, knight h6 was played. I went king h8. I thought that was smarter than stepping up. If you step up to g7, then white just gets a tempo with knight g4 and is actually threatening bishop h6. So I thought that the king should go to h8. The one downside to going to h8 is that now this f7 pawn is a little bit loose, so my rook is tied down there for the time being. Bishop h3. Bishop h3 is an interesting idea. It's like trying to maybe think about like knight takes f7 check and bishop takes e6. But it's actually just a huge blunder. And believe it or not, black is actually completely winning from this position, but I didn't see it. So I'll give you a moment to pause the video and essentially try and figure out what's what here. All right, so hopefully you got a chance to pause the video. The best move in this position is not the one I played, but it's d4. And the idea is now that this bishop has left this diagonal, I have this monstrous diagonal to operate on, and it's just a great move. The other thing is that the rook now is cut off from the action. It's totally cut off. And the detail that I missed was that I'm actually just threatening knight dc5 in a lot of lines and queen d5. So let me take away some of those arrows. Knight dc5 and queen d5. And this battery is just monstrous. The other thing that concerned me, and the reason I didn't go d4, was that I was thinking that, you know, again, this knight takes f7 and bishop takes e6 threat. But now that's not actually a threat. If you go knight takes f7 and I go rook takes and bishop takes e6, this knight is just hanging because the bishop has left the g2 square. So I can just go bishop takes f3 and then move my rook away. And yeah, I should have seen this, but I didn't. Oh well, very unfortunate. So yeah, it was just a miss, actually. So after d4, white would pretty much, have to go bishop takes e6. But after f takes e6, again, you can see the bishop and the rook are screaming on this diagonal, and white will just not survive this for too long. You could try bishop f4 blocking the diagonal, but now I have bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, and knight c5 first, hitting the rook on a4, and after rook c4, g5, and now I'm just winning a piece. These are the type of tactics I just need to see. It's something I need to get better at, for sure. And I've gotten better at it over the course of the year, but tactics still remain to be my weak point. So anyways, I did not see that stuff, and instead I went for knight dc5, which I thought, hey, covers the knight, attacks the rook, but it's not the best move. And now knight d4 was played. A pretty interesting move. Again, putting some pressure on e6 again, arguing that taking on a4 is a little bit risky because the e6 is loose. I went queen e8. The reason I did that is because I was looking at lines with like knight takes a4, and I didn't like knight takes f7 check, rook takes, and stuff like knight takes e6 was a little bit weird to me. I don't know. There were just some lines here I was a little concerned about. There's also bishop takes e6 and the knight on a4 is still hanging. It just seemed very, very risky to me. Also, after knight takes a4, there's also just queen takes a4 and retaining some of those threats. So I'm not sure if I made the right decision here because I see rook c4 and stuff like that. But yeah, I went queen e8. I just wanted to defend everything. After queen e8, white did take on e6. And again, there's this question, how do you capture? How do you capture? And I thought that it was great to just open the f line for my rook, so I played f takes e6. But it turns out that knight takes e6 is actually better. The point is that I'm keeping an eye on this rook still, and I'm threatening d4. And after bishop g2, bishop c6, this rook is really caught out because, again, I've covered most of the squares, nearly all the squares on that the rook can actually go to. So rook g4 would be the only move. And now I can go d4 and get the desired trade that I actually wanted all along, which is the light squared bishops. And a position like this would certainly be in black's favor because I have better control of the center, better control on the queen side, and my king could just step up to g7 at the right moment. So another slightly missed opportunity. Instead, I played f takes e6, and I still retain some advantage now because, again, it looks like this diagonal is going to open. My bishop has good scope. But white played rook d4, and this is a move I very much underestimated because it shuts down this diagonal that I wanted to be opened. I played knight e4. It looks like such a natural move, eyeing the f2 pawn, putting pressure here, looking at bishop c5, but it's actually not the best move. An even stronger move would have been g5. And the point is now I bring my queen over to the king side with queen g6, and I take advantage of this knight being a little bit loose. Additionally, now f4 it cannot be played so easily. Not that it was necessarily on tap right away, but I take away the square from white's pieces. So something I could have thought about. Instead, I went knight e4. White went f3 to challenge my knight. And then I went knight g5, hitting the bishop and the pawn. I thought this was great. It looked like I'm hitting things. I'm threatening bishop c5. I felt pretty good. But I just missed some details. White went bishop g2, and here I kind of realized what my problem was. I really want to play bishop c5, but then my knight is just hanging. So, and now with my knight on g5, it doesn't have a lot of squares. E4 is taken, h3 is taken. So, and if I go back to f7, I'm just trading this knight on h6. So the problem is my knight is really kind of not ideally placed. I went knight f7 to try and resolve that problem. But you could see after this trade that white has gotten the time they needed to consolidate. King h1 was played, and now you can see in this position, black still is reasonable play. It's not like black is problematic, but now it's a game. Now it's a fight. And before there were so many tactical opportunities I had missed. And so now it's just an equal position, and I just got to keep playing. So I thought, okay, my counterplay now is probably going to rest either on the f file or the c file, and I tried to make that happen. So first I went bishop a6, improving my bishop, getting it on a nice active diagonal. Bishop h6, good move, just taking advantage of some of these dark squares and hemming in my king a little bit. Bishop f8, trying to trade those bishops. Queen d2, bishop takes, queen takes, and now queen f8. And my idea here was, maybe I can get to an endgame where I have better control of the c file, and my bishop is a little bit more active, and my d pawn might be protected past pawn. So I thought endgame probably would be a way I can outplay my opponent. Queen e3 back was played, and now I went rook c2, invading on the second rank, hitting the b2 pawn. Rook d2, and now rook c6 back, just covering the b6 pawn. Rook a d1, king g7. Again, I want to cover some of these dark squares so that I don't have to worry about queen h6 again. And now h4, I think that's a good move. Thinking about h5, making me worry about some of these things. And in this position, I was very annoyed because even though I have control of the c file, you can actually see that my dark squares on the king side are kind of weak. And so white's always going to have some chances to harass my king. And it's really imperative that these queens come off the board if I'm really to press this one. And it was hard to make that happen. I went rook f5 to just try and stop h5 because that was also something I was worried about. But better would have maybe been queen c5, trying to trade queens. I mean, white wouldn't allow it. They'd probably go rook d4, but at least I'm thinking about, I'm making white make tough decisions. So rook f5, f4, I think it's a good move. Again, cementing all of these dark squares. The one flaw with it is maybe at some point some of these light squares could be weak and I have a light squared bishop, but we're a ways off from that. And now I even have to worry about bishop h3 hitting my rook on f5. I went rook f7 back, just prophylactically dealing with that threat. King h2. And now queen c5. And then rook d4. And we saw, okay, white's like, no, we're not trading queens. It's not going to be that easy. And then I went queen e7 back, rook d2, and now rook c5. And the idea here is that I'm blocking the queen's diagonal from hitting b6. I'm getting my rook onto a dark square so that this bishop on g2 can't harass it. And maybe I'll try and get an Alekhein's gun on the c-file. For those of you that don't know, an Alekhein's gun is when all of the heavy pieces are lined up on a file vertically. Excuse me, horizontally. Excuse me, vertically. All right. So I'm mixing up vertically and horizontally. Okay. So rook d4, and now rook f8. I'm trying to get the Alekhine gun plan. Queen f3. And now queen f3 annoyed me a little bit because now I was a little bit worried about h5. So I was like, I don't know, should I allow that? Should I allow that? I wound up allowing it. I went rook c2 because I'm actually threatening now bishop e2, a very cheeky skewer. So then rook d4 is played. And then I went queen c5, and again my idea was that maybe I'm infiltrating on the queen side, and it's h5 is not going to matter because I might have rook f5 or something along those lines. So queen g4 is played, trying to target the e6 pawn, and I went rook f5, blocking that. And the nice thing about rook f5 here is that I'm actually shutting down the h5 push. King h3 is played. Very, very strange move to me, king h3. I don't understand it. I think my opponent was in a bit of time trouble, well, that's what happens sometimes. But it doesn't fundamentally change things too drastically. I thought it was a good moment now, though, to play rook c1 and kind of, tease out the back rank, because now the king on h3 is a little bit airy. And additionally, if this bishop on g2 ever moves, my bishop on a6 might get to f1 with decisive effect. So these are some of the things I was thinking about. Rook d1, and now h5. And I was pleased at the timing now because I thought by fixing these pawns, I might have weak light squares to toy with later if my bishop ever got in the game. Queen f3 was played, and now rook c2 back, rook d2, and now rook f7. And now I was thinking, all right, now it's time to get the other one in the game. Queen b3, rook c1. Again, I'm not so eager to trade very quickly because I was a little bit wary of the liquidation. So I was trying to keep peace on the board. But now rook d1 came, and I took because it was hard to keep it together for so long. But now I get in with bishop e2, and I thought this was perfect timing because my bishop finally, that started on d7, was it on d7? Well, no, it started on c8, but my bishop finally got in the game and got to the king side, and you don't really think that's going to happen with a pawn on e6. So I was kind of happy that I was able to get this maneuver off, and I've still maintained control of the c-file. So far, so good. Everything is kind of in tow right now. Rook d2 is played, and now bishop g4 check, king h2, and rook c7. And if I could not have drawn this up any better. I mean, this was pretty much the dream scenario with all the maneuvering the past 15 to 20 moves, and I got the scenario I wanted. So now is about infiltration, trying to infiltrate in a clean way. White played bishop f3 to try and trade by bishops, and I went queen c1, invading. Note the rook on d2 is hanging. This other rook might come to c2 if the white one leaves the second rank. And so I'm in the house. I'm in the backyard. I'm almost in the house. Rook f2 was played. And now I went queen e1, again tickling that rook, trying to invade with rook c1 and getting queen g1 mate, trying to get in there. Rook e2 was played, hitting my queen. And now we were both, I must say, in pretty heavy time trouble. And I used more time than I normally use in games. I think a little bit because I was nervous and I was really trying to win this game, so I was thinking over very carefully how to avoid different drawn sequences. And in this position, I have a forced win. I'll give you a moment to pause the video and try to calculate that forced win. So I'll give you 5 seconds to pause, think about it, and then I'll jump back in. All right, so the move that I should have played but did not play was Queen F1. And I saw this move, Queen F1. I saw it, but I did not go deep enough. The point is that you attack the F3 bishop and you attack the E2 rook with the queen. Fair enough, right? So bishop takes F3 is forced. And after H takes G4, rook C2, in this position, from just 2 or 3 moves away, I just had a moment of blindness, and I thought, oh, well, these rooks are traded, and I don't have any play here. I mean, rook... but it turns out, I just made the move by mistake, but it turns out there's this queen h3 check move, very, very important. And after king g1, now I trade on c2, and I just take the house. I just take on f4 with check, or with on h4 check. I'm 2 pawns up. My queen comes back to defend any perpetual checks, and it's game over. Man. And the funny thing about it is, or the sad thing about it, however you want to look at it, is my opponent pointed this out to me right after the game, and I was like in shock that I missed this detail. I was like, oh, cannot believe it. I was basically, it was just not going deep enough. I thought on general principles, oh, rook c2 trades the rooks, end of the line, and no, I just missed this queen h3 check. Very unfortunate. And because of that, I decided to go for another line. So I went queen b1, trying to control the c2 square. And now white gets a chance to play queen takes b6, and that is the move. That's the move that holds things together, because now the queen is attacking the rook, so it doesn't have to defend the bishop, and it's even eyeing the king side. So if I try to move rook c2 or something, white can go back to f2 and cover things up. Yeah, very disappointing. So I tried what I thought was my next best chance, and I went bishop takes f3. Point being that after queen takes c7 check and king h6, white has no checks, and I'm threatening queen h1 mate. The problem is that it's not enough because of rook g2. And again, I'm just not in time to get anything going. I actually went queen f1, trying to threaten mate still, because if you go rook g1, I have queen f2 check. But here, queen c2 is a move, and again, now the queen comes back, and I'm even a pawn down in this scenario. I can't. It's hard to win this. Now I do have this passed d pawn, which is the, I thought maybe would give me some chances, so I tried to keep playing for a little bit. I went bishop takes g2, queen takes, and queen d1, trying to usher that pawn up the board. But white played queen g1, which is a very reasonable move, yeah, it's tough to really get something going here. I went queen d2 check, and now queen g2 just blocks, and then I went queen d3, just trying to stop the queen's infiltrating squares. But now white went g4, very good move, and the point is white is trying to just rip open my king side and get a perpetual check. I went queen e3, trying to target the f4 pawn. Queen g3 protecting, good move. I checked again, king h3, and I'm not making progress here. And again, g takes h5 is a threat, and I'm a pawn down, so I have to be a little careful. I went king g7, g takes h5, queen takes. And yeah, now queen a3, very reasonable move, trying to get in with these checks. And there's just nothing I can do. Queen f5 check, king g3, and king h6. And now I was actually playing with fire because I'm a pawn down. I was trying to keep the game going. But after queen e3, I don't have any prospects, and my d-pawn is not even being pushed up the board. And now I really don't want white to make a pass pawn on the queen side. So I went king h5 to threaten queen g4. And after queen f3, king h6, queen e3, a4, trying to get something going. Still playing with fire a little bit. b3, takes, and then king h5, queen e2, king h6, queen e3, king h5, queen e2, king h6. We repeated several times, and here we agreed to a draw. Tough game. I mean, I really thought I gave myself a good shot to win, but I just missed way too many tactical details. Whether it was nerves or not, I'm not gonna put too many excuses on it. But it was just up and down game that I had several chances to win and just wasn't able to put them away. I knew after this draw that I had no chance at the GM norm, and that was really disappointing. But I had one more game to go, and this was still a good tournament despite it all. And I was just thinking, you know what, time to just move on, keep going, and see what happens. Let's learn from this. Let's get better from this. Anyways, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by making a PayPal donation in the description. Thank you.